Throughout the history of the Pokémon trading card game, certain cards have stood out above the rest. Some have been celebrated for their innovation and creativity, while others have been reviled for their sheer power and dominance. The game's ever-evolving meta is shaped by these cards. Each set introduces new mechanics, strategies, and occasionally, a card that redefines how the game is played. There are cards that changed everything, from Luxray Level X, which controlled the board with its sniping power, to Seismitoad EX, which paralyzed entire strategies with item lock. These were cards that brought new challenges, but none of them created the kind of reaction we're about to discuss. For years, the competitive scene was a battlefield where players constantly sought the edge. Deck building skill, meta knowledge, and in-game tactics defined who rose to the top. But then, a card was released that would change everything. A card so dominant, so impactful, it reshaped the landscape of the game entirely. And as its influence grew, so too did the frustration among players. Whether you were a seasoned veteran or a new player, there was no escaping its presence. This was the card that sparked countless debates, polarized the community, and earned itself a reputation as the most hated card in the history of the Pokémon TCG. It was powerful, it was oppressive, and for many, it just simply wasn't fun to play against. This is the history of Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia, otherwise known as ADP. The Pokémon trading card game has always been evolving, with each new set introducing new cards, mechanics, and strategies, but in recent years, something had been creeping into the game. Slowly at first, but undeniably present. It was called power creep, the gradual increase in card power, pushing the limits of what was once considered strong to the point where older cards were just left in the dust. Cards were getting stronger, faster, and more versatile with each new expansion. The game was evolving into something bigger, more explosive, and harder to balance. Players saw the rise of GX and tag team Pokémon as part of the power shift. Massive, multi-price Pokémon with abilities that could swing games in an instant. These cards pushed the limits of what was possible. However, their raw power came with a price. You gave up 3 prize cards and they were knocked out. But the advantages they provided were just often too great to ignore. And for a while, this power creep seemed to work, creating an exciting and fast-paced meta. But while power creep added excitement, it also came with a cost. The game was becoming faster and more volatile. The careful balance between offensive power and defensive strategy began to erode, and players found themselves chasing the next big thing in an increasingly high-stakes meta. Players adapted, finding ways to counter these powerhouses, and the game continued to thrive in this delicate balance. But then, a card was released that would shatter this balance, a card that embodied the very essence of power creep, taking it to a next level that the game had never seen before. This card was not just powerful, it was game-breaking. It was the product of power creep at its peak, pushing the boundaries of the game's design, and quickly becoming a nightmare for players at all levels. In November 2019, the Cosmic Eclipse set was released. Among the new cards was ADP, a tag team GX featuring 3 legendary Pokémon that on the surface seemed like another exciting addition to the game, but hidden within its mechanics was a GX attack that would go on to redefine the meta and ignite one of the greatest controversies in the game's history. ADP's Altered Creation GX boosted the damage output of every attack by 30 damage, and if that wasn't enough, with the investment of an additional water energy, it allowed players to just take an additional prize card for every knockout they took for the rest of the game. This wasn't just power creep, this created a snowball effect. Once ADP successfully activated Altered Creation, the game's pace drastically sped up. Opponents had fewer turns to set up, fewer chances to retaliate, and the overwhelming pressure ADP applied meant games often just ended in a few turns, leaving opponents with little to no room to maneuver. ADP represented the apex of the power creep era, taking everything that had come before it and pushing it to the extreme. It allowed players to secure prize cards faster than ever before, and cutting games short and removing just so much of that counterplay that it kept the meta in check. How did this card come to dominate the meta so completely? To answer that, we need to dive into the rise of ADP, and the ways in which it reshaped the competitive landscape, paving the way for one of the most hated eras in the Pokémon trading card game. Before ADP's release, the meta was defined by a relatively balanced power struggle. Tag teams like Pikachu and Zekrom GX, Reshiram and Charizard, and Mewtwo and Mew GX dominated the scene. But their high price costs balanced out their strength. Decks like Malamar and Pidgeotto Control thrived on creative counterplay, using resource management and strategy to stay competitive in a fast-paced environment. Decks had to strike a delicate balance between powerful attackers and control strategies. While aggressive decks could overwhelm opponents, control decks could often outlast and outmaneuver them. But ADP would go on to completely disrupt that balance. Soon after the release of Cosmic Eclipse came the first set of the Sword and Shield era, and this brought along the final puzzle piece in this not-so-pretty picture, Zacian V. Arguably one of the strongest cards ever printed in the Pokémon TCG. Its ability Intrepid Sword not only allowed players to draw cards, but also provided crucial energy acceleration. This made Zacian V an immediate threat on the board. Once Zacian V entered the competitive scene, it didn't take long for players to realize its full potential. ADP quickly became the central piece in one of the most feared and hated decks of all time, ADP Zacian. Pairing ADP with Zacian V, a Pokémon capable of doing 230 damage for just 3 energy, turned ADP into an unstoppable force. With Altered Creation GX in play, Zacian V could take out even the most bulkiest of Pokémon and take 3 prize cards along with it. Games were often ending in as few as 3 attacks. Players quickly realized that ADP Zacian was not only powerful, but also just removed so much of that skill expression in the game. Instead of thoughtful decision making, games boiled down to whether or not the ADP player could get Altered Creation GX off by the second or third turn. If they could, the game was almost guaranteed to be in their favour. ADP wasn't just powerful, it was oppressive, and that's why it became so universally hated, by players of all skill levels. The card eliminated so many of the nuances that made the Pokémon TCG exciting. Its ability to take extra prize cards completely disregarded slower, more strategic decks. Control decks, which relied on carefully managing resources and tempo, just simply couldn't keep up. Decks focused on spreading damage or single prize attackers were just also left flat in the dust. Competitive matches that once showcased skill, planning, and adaptation now became a race to see who could activate Altered Creation GX first. Many players felt powerless as ADP rendered entire archetypes obsolete. To make matters worse, even decks designed to counter ADP were often unable to keep up with its overwhelming tempo. But why did ADP become such a problem? The answer lies in the game's ongoing power creep. ADP wasn't just an anomaly, it was the product of years of increasing power levels in the Pokémon TCG. With each new set, Pokémon became bulkier, attacks more powerful, and abilities more game-breaking. ADP was simply the next step in that power creep, pushing the boundaries of what a card could do to the point where it broke the balance of the game. ADP wasn't just powerful, it was the culmination of years of pushing the game's power levels higher and higher. And as the power levels increased, the gap between strong cards and broken cards became harder to navigate. The emergence of ADP as a powerhouse in the Pokémon TCG came at a pivotal moment. As the card began to dominate the meta, the world was hit by the pandemic. This unprecedented situation brought a wave of uncertainty, forcing major tournaments to shift from in-person events to online play. Instead, the online environment allowed the community to adapt and innovate. It gave rise to a variety of counter-strategies as players explored new deck archetypes and shared their experiences in real time. However, this also meant that ADP was essentially limited to an online format where its strengths could both be amplified and mitigated. With the shift to online play, players sought ways to adapt their strategies. The allure of quick victories fueled a surge in the popularity of ADP Zacian decks, which swiftly swept through the virtual competitions, racking up wins and leaving opponents scrambling for solutions. ADP was dominant in a virtual space, where quick adjustments could be made, yet it was never truly tested in a high-stakes in-person tournament environment. This left many players wondering just how much more formidable ADP could have been if the pandemic had never intervened.